This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is The States of the Earth, An Ecological and Racial History of Secularization by Mohammed Amir Meziane. While industrial states competed to colonize Asia and Africa in the 19th century, conversion to Christianity was replaced by a civilizing mission. This new secular impetus came hand in hand with racial capitalism in the age of empires. A terrestrial paradise was to be achieved through accumulation and the ravaging of nature. Far from a defense of religion, The States of the Earth argues that phenomena such as evangelism and political Islam are best understood as products of empire and secularization. In a world where material technology was considered divine, religious and secular forces both tried to achieve heaven on earth by destroying Earth itself. States of the Earth, An Ecological and Racial History of Secularization by Mohammed Amir Meziane. Out now from Verso Books. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is the 9th episode of Thawra, The Dig's rolling series on 20th century Arab politics with historian Abdel Razzaq Takriti. Thawra is Arabic for revolution. It's a word that contains historical multitudes, diverse political radicalisms and revolts that have swept across Arab lands over the past century. Our last installment covered the first decade of the movement of Arab nationalists, founded as the Arab Nationalist Youth in 1951. The movement of Arab nationalists was in significant part led by Palestinians, and it built a substantial presence in Beirut and in Jordan and became a truly powerful force in Kuwait. The organization ultimately became critical to the history of Arab anti-colonial radicalism in general, and to the Palestinian National Liberation Movement in particular, because it led to the creation of multiple radical Marxist groups, including the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the major left-wing factions of the struggle, South Yemen's National Liberation Front, which in 1967, after the British departure, established the Socialist People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, and the Dhofar Liberation Front, which carried out armed struggle against the Sultan of Muscat and Oman from the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s. All important movements that we'll discuss in another couple episodes or so. This episode covers Palestinian national liberation politics throughout the 1950s as they were pieced together among a people expelled from their land and dispersed across the region by the Nakba. Organizations, alliances, and theories of change assembled in universities, cities, and refugee camps surrounding Palestine. We culminate our discussion with the foundation of Fatah in 1959, breaking with the pan-Arab mold that had previously shaped mass-oriented nationalist politics in Palestine. Fatah was the first organization for Palestinians, led by Palestinians, focused first and foremost on Palestinian liberation. This, the story we're telling today, is the beginning of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement as we've come to know it today. Before we get started, two quick things. First, this is a not-for-profit political education project that we put everything into, and we don't paywall a single episode because we want everyone possible to listen. The only reason we can do that is because listeners like you voluntarily choose to donate at patreon.com/thedig. We also have gifts to send you, depending on how much you give and where you live, and all contributors get our excellent newsletter delivered straight to your email inbox. That's patreon.com/thedig. And so if you've been hemming and hawing about contributing, just click the link and do it. Please. We really appreciate it. Second, please spread the word about Thawra. Post about the series on social media or get a comrade to start listening. There's no other history of Arab and Palestinian radicalism as cohesive and comprehensive as the one that Abed is recounting here. Lastly, I want to extend all my solidarity and love to the students and faculty out there fighting for a free Palestine. What's happening right now is an extraordinarily serious challenge to U.S. empire and the settler colonial genocide taking place under its umbrella. That's why administrators, the mainstream media, Biden, the cops, and the right wing have all united in this Orwellian block against you, demonizing and slandering you, beating and arresting you. Thank you for not only keeping up the struggle, but expanding and escalating it. Your bravery and conviction really does fill me with hope and awe every single day. Okay, here's Abdel Razzaq Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University. A scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements, he's the author of Monsoon Revolutions, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website, an incredible resource that will be back online soon. I want to zoom out from the movement of Arab nationalists and talk about Palestinian politics more broadly during the 1950s, because in the years immediately following the Nakba, the locus of Palestinian resistance, of course, was not in the occupied territories. Those territories were not yet the occupied territories. They only became occupied in 1967 when Israel conquered Gaza from Egypt and the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan. So in the 1950s, we have large numbers of Palestinians, including many, many refugees, living throughout Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Kuwait, as you mentioned, alongside the Palestinians who lived within the new state of Israel under military rule at the time. So what do Palestinian politics as national politics look like in the 1950s with Palestine's Mandate-era leadership defeated, the Palestinian people dispersed and fragmented, and Palestinian politics so often expressed through this broader pan-Arab nationalist politics? What were Palestinian politics in the 1950s?
So when you look at the 1940s, the late 40s, you had a collapse in 48 of the old party structure in Palestine. There used to be parties that were specific to Palestine. But then, as you mentioned, with the loss of 78% of Palestine, which gets absorbed by the settler colonist Zionist movement that renames the territory as the State of Israel, essentially there's a destruction of the entire old party structure in Palestine. And those parties were not primarily ideological in character. They were centered around alliances and figures. They had their own debates. The primary debate was the extent to which there was going to be discussion and a cooperation with the British authorities or clash with them. So you had the wing of the Palestinian movement, that wing headed by the Mufti, Haj Amin Husseini, which was less amenable to strong relations with the British, and that was more combative towards them, but still within the bounds of the mandate. And then you had another wing led by Raghib Nashashibi, which was seen as closer to the British, and also closer later on to figures allied with them, like Prince Abdullah, the Hashemites, later on, of course. So with the collapse of Palestine and the occupation of the majority of it, by the way, the occupied territories is a term that's used after 48, but Palestinians and Arabs use it to refer to the Israeli state. That was actually the original occupied territories from 1948 to 1967. If you said the occupied territories, that was referring to all the areas that constitute the Israeli state today. And that's difficult for the listenership here to understand sometimes. What they don't know is that as an indigenous people, and as surrounding people who are indigenous to the region, like the Arab peoples around it, they did not accept the legitimacy of a settler colonial state.
Yes, it's not just settlers aren't just in the West Bank today, but throughout the entirety of historic Palestine.
Yeah, and that's actually a factual reality. It's just people here give it a different framing, so it becomes acceptable to them. But they're not the ones that were expelled from their villages and cities and towns. They're not the ones that received a huge amount of bullets and guns and bombs dropped on them, and that were essentially told that they have to give way for a settler colonist population coming from Europe, and that had some of them had barely been in the land for 2, 3, 4 years. So it's a difficult subject for people to talk about in this country, partly because of the horrors of the Holocaust. But from an Arab or Palestinian perspective, these horrors were inflicted by Europe on its European citizens for no fault other than them being Jewish. So the genocidal European practices and thinking and ideologies were not Palestinian ideologies and thinking, were not Arab ideologies and practices. They were committed in Europe against Europeans.
And as we'll get to in future episodes, 1967 both ignites a new historic phase in the Palestinian national liberation struggle, but it also, in many ways, Israel's occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, it also sort of retroactively normalizes the 78% of historic Palestine conquered by Zionists in 1948.
In some circles. And that becomes a big subject of debate within the Palestinian revolutionary movement itself, of course. And we'll talk about that later on. But for now, nobody has accepted the idea of the loss of Palestine as a fait accompli that everybody should just be comfortable with. And as I mentioned earlier in reference to the movement of Arab nationalists, part of actually what the movement of Arab nationalists was focusing on is essentially defeating that idea, that they were worried that it was going to be normalized, that Palestine was lost, that 78% of the territory was lost, and that it had only now a minority of its indigenous population living within it. Now, at the same time, we should be very careful to note that you have some Zionist propaganda that constantly presents the Palestinian wish to return and to liberate the land as some sort of eradicationist, anti-Jewish, or even in the best version, anti-settler colonists and wanting them to leave or so on and so forth. I think we have to be very clear here. The majority of people did not want like mass expulsions, or they were not focused on that. They were more focused on their own fate. They were talking about the culture of return, the right of return. They were not talking about the right to expel. And in Arabic, it's haqq al-awda. They're not talking about let's expel the people that had arrived there. Even though those people that had arrived did not come from Palestine. They came from Poland, for the most part, and from Ukraine, and from other parts of the world. Later on, of course, a lot of Arab Jews end up getting absorbed into that project. And we'll talk about that maybe later on when we talk about Iraq. We'll mention that discussion.
It just says a lot more about the Zionist and colonialist imaginary that the right to return, or Palestine being free from the river to the sea, for Zionists or colonialists immediately provokes the specter of violence against the colonizer. That's the first thing that comes to mind.
Which is pretty classic. Like in South Africa, they were saying all the time, how can we put the white, population there under the mercy? And I'm here, I'm putting it between quotes. That's how they were framing it, of a black population. And it's like, well, the black population is the original people of the land, and they are the majority in that land. And there's nothing wrong with people living together. Yes, the white population will not have a majority there, but that does not justify it excluding the black population from the political process and from its natural political, national, and other rights. So these questions, of course, apply in Palestine, apply in South Africa. In Algeria, the same thing was going on. The French were saying, well, the Pied Noir, should never be subjected to Algerian rule. And eventually, by the way, the Pied Noir end up leaving precisely because they were afraid of Algerian rule. The official FLN ideology was not to expel the French settlers. They left partly because they believed in this myth of the monstrous native that is out there for blood. And, of course, we know this myth has a very old history. Even in Haiti, it was a big history. And I'm like, well, actually, Toussaint was very open to even white slave owners. He was willing to be very tolerant of them. It's only when they gave him no choice and they had a genocidal program and they killed him, basically. That you get Dessalines being like, I'm fed up, and of course he does that famous voodoo ceremony and where he takes the white off from the Haitian flag, but he's still like, remember, like he includes whites into the black category, Dessalines, like even in that context, the whites that decided to fight against slavery. So I don't want to go too tangential here, but it's a global phenomenon.
And it's important because that also means what you're saying is that even the juxtaposition of the Algerian versus South African solution that we hear so often about when it comes to Palestine is itself premised on a misreading of the National Liberation Project in Algeria.
Absolutely. The National Liberation Project in Algeria, I challenge anyone on this. They keep saying, oh, they expelled the Pieds Noirs, whatever. I like that was not part of the FLN program. The Pieds Noirs were so freaked out by their own mythologies that they left. And by the way, there still remained like about 80,000 French in Algeria. And, it's not I'm not saying that anti-colonialism is a perfect process in which no settler dies or gets killed or even violently killed. I'm not saying Mau did not kill white settlers, or FLN did not kill white settlers, or the Palestinian Liberation Movement did not kill white settlers, or that the South African Liberation Movement did not do that. I mean, but it's clear from the perspective of peoples in Africa and Asia, and of course parts of Latin America that have had these kind of struggles, it's completely ridiculous and outrageous to claim that the native is the evil eradicationist force.
It's pure projection, when in fact the colonizer is the eradicationist force, where the native consistently expresses far more willingness than the colonizer to live in peace and equality side by side with their colonizer.
All the time. And by the way, even inside the United States, I often reflect on that. Like, how freaked out all these white slave owners were about enslaved people's rebellions. And even now, like when there's so-called race riots in this country, it's outrageous. It's being presented as, oh, white neighborhoods are going to be overcome by like these enraged black youth that are gonna. And I'm like, they are the victims of the system. It's not like it's like outrageous. It's such projection, and you're suddenly presenting them as the problem and as the threat, and it's very painful, and it's painful every time you see it and hear it. It's so unjust and so unfair. But unfortunately, it's part of how colonialism functions. It needs these ideological fantasies to be able to function. I need to perpetuate these visions, because otherwise, what is the justification? How can you sleep at night unless you invent these stories? And through these stories, you become you can reconcile liberalism or a self-vision as a liberal subject, while at the same time perpetuating the worst crimes possible. And scholars have been writing about this for a long time.
What did Palestinian politics look like in the absence of the sort of organized, politically independent national liberation movement that would later emerge? And maybe let's start on a sociological level. What are Palestinian everyday realities like in this decade after the Nakba? And then what sort of politics does that give shape to?
So, Daniel, you had initially the struggle to return. So these were refugee communities that had been expelled from their country, that are expelled from their lands. Some of them actually were internal refugees. Some of them moved from the part of Palestine that got occupied in 1948 and that was renamed as Israel, and they ended up in the West Bank or Gaza. Some of them became internal refugees within their parts that were lost in 1948. To this day, by the way, they exist. There are Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel that are not allowed to go back to their villages or reclaim their lands. They got internally displaced. And then you had people that ended up being forced into Lebanon or Syria or Jordan, and to a lesser extent, Egypt and Iraq. It was all a product of circumstance and partly geography. So most of the people that were in the northern Galilee on the western side ended up in Lebanon. Most of the people that were in the Safad region, the eastern side of the Galilee, and they ended up in Syria. That's why you have so many people from Safad and Yarmouk camp and other major camps in Syria. And then people that were in the Jordan Valley, a lot of them ended up in Jordan. The people that were in the Haifa district, some of them ended up in the north western part of the West Bank or ended up in Lebanon. And, southern Palestine almost entirely ended up moving to Gaza, through that evil operation called Operation Yoav, after which Yoav Gallant, the current defense minister, is named because his father carried out the ethnic cleansing. It was a big officer in that operation. And then he named his son after it because he thought he did such a great job. And now, of course, his son is carrying out ethnic cleansing in Gaza today with the genocidal intent that is very clear. So people ended up in places depending on the geography. Ones that ended up in Gaza were from the Nakba desert. They were from Bir Saba. They were from the western parts of the Hebron district. Even more, you had a lot of people from the areas south of Jaffa, like Isdud and Asqalan, Majd al-Asqalan, which is Ashkelon today, or Isdud became Ashdod. They renamed all these places, of course. Hamama, all these areas, they ended up in Gaza. And Palestinian politics then becomes heavily determined by the presence of these large refugee communities. Now, when people congregate in a refugee camp, their politics gets transformed even by virtue of the existence of the camp. Because a camp houses people from many different villages, many different towns. And it allows for the sort of like emergence of discussions on a broader level than the mini village level. And that's an important sociological phenomena that we have to think about.
Something similar to industrialization or urbanization and those sorts of processes that bring people from rural or village life into denser urban networks.
Absolutely. Also, it changes the class structure, because this was previously predominantly, as I mentioned, a landed people working the land. They're coming in now, they're congregating in these camps. Obviously, they've lost their lands. Sometimes they're working in other people's lands now. There are, refugees that are working in agricultural communities. Some refugee camps actually emerge in rural areas, and some refugees end up settling in rural areas, like the Jordan Valley, for example, like some of the areas around Jericho. There are agricultural projects around there. But then you have also a proletarianization going on, where the camps offer a good working class resource for people. And there's a lumpen proletarianization going on in places like Lebanon, where people are prevented from working. So you end up with people who are perfectly having basically to struggle for a living in substantial ways. All of that was going on. One thing I should note, most of the refugee camps have a class composition that is worth thinking about, because the rich people, for the most part, did not end up in camps. And most of the urban middle class and upper classes did not end up in camps. That's why the mythology that every Palestinian refugee is living in a refugee camp is incorrect. And I think people misunderstand what refugee means in this world. For example, I'm a Palestinian refugee, but I'm a Palestinian university professor at an American university, and I'm living in Houston, Texas. You would think that a Palestinian refugee has to be in a Palestinian refugee camp in the region. That's not the way it works. Refugee is a political category. It means that you've lost your country, you're unable to go back to it, and your descendants inherit it. Now, there are these amazing moves that are going on now. The Israelis and Americans in the West have been trying to create all sorts of exceptionalism around Palestine. And from the very beginning, they were doing that to try to say, well, they shouldn't pass on this category. And I'm like, yeah, but you're not saying that in relation to the rest of the world.
The Intercept just uncovered this New York Times internal memo, a style guide, basically cautioning reporters against describing refugee camps in Gaza as such.
Absolutely. And that's part of this project to liquidate the category of Palestinian refugees, to suppress the numbers. Because if you say there are no longer any Palestinian refugees, then they no longer have the right of return. Then the settlers have won. Essentially, that's it. You have to say it's a fait accompli. There is no indigenous population. And it's a way of eradicating indigenous futures. So when we look at that, the people were very cognizant about these attempts to erase the refugee category, but also to reduce it to a humanitarian question rather than a political one. from the moment of the Nakba onwards. Palestinians were resisting this humanitarianization of their case. They were saying, look, we do not want resettlement. We want repatriation. And this was something they insisted on, and they were willing to go to great lengths towards. They were even, when they were suspecting that some of the Arab states were going to create resettlement, some of the refugee camps were so concerned that they were even opposed to construction of roads within the camp and these kind of services that would suggest permanence. This at the early stage, there was such resistance to anything that would, because people wanted to go back home, Daniel, and it's a natural and normal human urge. They did not want to live in these camps. These camps, by the way, initially were tent cities. And, you know, when the Nakba first happened, like, it was cold that year, by the way. It was like nasty. The conditions were horrible. It was a harsh winter that came. And the tents lasted for several years until people started bringing in these zinc structures and different like metal structures, and they built, you know, makeshift arrangements. Eventually, they started like building more permanent structures. In places like Lebanon, there were laws against construction within the camps. There was such a severe and repressive environment. But still, there was heavy organizing on the part of people within the camps. And the state was wary of that. They did not want them to organize. Nevertheless, there was organizing going on. There in Lebanon, you had a mixture between traditional forms of social mobilization and the ideological modern party forms that we've been describing. And it's interesting, sometimes these cross-fertilized in interesting ways. So the older generation tended to still operate on kinship lines and on geographic lines. You had this interesting thing. If you go to any Palestinian camp to this very day, you will find that people from the same village would tend to congregate in a quarter of the camp. And often people from the families of these villages would tend to congregate within that quarter together. So in a way, they were reproducing the kinship networks and the geographic networks that had existed before, but in this kind of more constrained space, which is the camp. So yes, you have now an amalgamation of villages. It's almost, the camp is basically, if you think of it in geographic terms, it's all the villages put together into one space. But the human groups still affiliate in ways that retain some of the past forms of organization. And that meant also that some of the leadership structures, especially ones that were centered around village elders and prominent figures, and in the case of Bedouin, you know, communities that ended up in refugee camps, some of the older Bedouin sheikhs still had their prestige and authority, and they would still, by the way, meet at night. They had a tradition in every Palestinian community, you know, especially in rural ones. You had the tradition called the Madafe tradition, which is the mayor of a village or the sheikh of the tribe would basically open up a space where people come and congregate, and they discuss the issues of the day, including politics and so on. So you had this situation where that was reproduced also in camps. And they would often talk about questions relating to return, questions relating to conspiracies against the Palestinian cause.
Did the sort of quotidian everyday politics of the camps, did it create an opening for the modern ideological parties, the organizations that we've spent so much of this series discussing, the Ba'ath, the communists, the movement of Arab nationalists?
Modern political parties were able to enter the camps through these structures in peculiar ways. For example, we know from one of the cadres of the movement of Arab nationalists in Lebanon, Salah, somebody I interviewed, he joined the movement through distributing the party newspaper in these circles. But people could not read amongst the older population. But because he was a young person, he had entered school, he would come and sit there as a young student and read to these older, you know, village elders who were curious about these things, from Al-Thawra, which is the movement of Arab nationalists, or the Arab nationalist youth's mouthpiece at the time. And it would echo with them, like, this stuff they were receptive to this kind of material. Yeah, because it would talk about conspiracies to resettle refugees and not repatriate them. It would talk about these issues. And later on, when there would be an occasion to demonstrate, through these young people, you would have the movements like the movement of Arab nationalists, but also other movements, activate broader networks. Because young people would come to the elders, be like, we need you, we need your help. We're organizing a demonstration against resettlement or against the Baghdad Pact, against this imperialist conspiracy that's directed at Palestine and everything else in this region, so on and so forth, all these issues. And the elders would come in and essentially, like, they would call for action, and people would follow them. So you had this intersection going on. Now, with time, of course, party structures started gaining more prominence, and the modern form overcame some elements of this old kinship organizing, but it never completely disappeared. So you had a combination of both. And it's an interesting feature of working class life in the camp, that even though there was an urbanization process going on, but still a bit of the village still remained. And in a way, that's a bit of Palestine still remained. A lot of Palestine still remained, of the old Palestine still remained, in the way that people affiliated and congregated. And I don't want to romanticize that by any level, because it also brought with it some conservatism in social norms and various other, it's a complicated discussion. And, a lot of the radical movements were both wanting to utilize these structures, but also were trying to eradicate them at the same time. So you had an interesting dynamic going on here. Now, moving beyond this sociological level, you had these movements that operated at that organic level, in which you could unite the whole camp against resettlement and for a culture of return. But then you had another form of organizing, which has taken place in student circles. And these were the most foundational and important for the creation of the new Palestinian politics, the rebuilding of the Palestinian body politic at this stage. So it's useful to think of this in slightly generational terms. So you had people that had experience in Palestinian politics before the Nakba, that basically were still young enough to be able to carry out that work after the Nakba. And these were people that were not tainted by the Nakba, in the sense that they did not belong to the official parties, the old parties that were deemed to have lost Palestine. These are people like Abdullah Rimawi, which founded Zabath Party, for example. These are people like Bahjat Abu Gharbi, which again is another Ba'athist figure. These are people like the Communist Party cadres. And the communists have their own, of course, trajectory in this whole experience. So they've had experience before in political work, and they were just continuing it. But then you have another phenomena emerging, which is this younger generation, like George Habash, that were literally a product of the Nakba. They could be referred to as the Nakba generation, in fact. They're a generation that knew Palestine, and here this is a description that Shafiq al-Hout used to be the PLO representative in Lebanon, and somebody who had joined the communist movement in Lebanon in the 50s, but later on, became very active in Palestinian work. Quite a remarkable figure. And by the way, he was an important influence on Edward Said when it came to Palestinian matters. So Shafiq al-Hout was somebody that came from Jaffa, knew Jaffa well. He said, look, we're the generation that knew Palestine, that knew the smells of Palestine, that knew the sights and sounds of it, but that ended up being expelled from it. We were old enough to know that place, and we were keen to organize for it. But they were young still. They're typically people who were 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. You see what I mean? So an interesting thing about them is many of them end up in universities and high schools. The ones that attained the best grades would typically end up in that, or the ones that came from lower middle class backgrounds or so on, where you had get enough money to be able to send the kid to get an education. You had the rise of also a new class background, with this new generation. So these were not the old leaderships that belonged to the famous families of Palestine, the notable families, the rich families, the land-owning families. Typically, however, these were not also from the working class. Most of them came somewhere from the lower middle classes, which by some definitions, some of them had petty bourgeois background, you could say. They were the sons of small traders or small, more prominent people on the local village level. And the key here is that their space in which their political socialization took place was the high school or the university. So it had to be somebody that was able to get to high school or university, which of course did include some working class members. But so this is the sociological background to this new leadership that's emerging.
How do these new Palestinian student movements and milieus, how do they come to serve as the key incubator for the organization of a politically independent Palestinian liberation struggle, namely the foundation of Fatah?
You have somebody like Yasser Arafat and his colleagues that were in something called Rabitat Talabat Palestine, Palestine Students, Rabita, like Palestine Students Association. Basically, this was a formation that was established in Egyptian universities in Cairo, okay? And it had student elections. It was there after the Nakba. This interesting young dynamic student from Gaza, Yasser Arafat, he had Egyptian upbringing, but he had Gazan father and a mother from Jerusalem. But then he had a strong Egyptian exposure because he had lived in Cairo for part of his life. But also he spent some time with his mother's family in Jerusalem. In any case, this young man is essentially close by sentiment to the old Mufti and his current, had helped try to secure weapons during 1948, even though he was very young, but still, he would smuggle them from Sinai to Gaza, was clearly very resourceful, and essentially belonged to an old conservative way of conducting politics, but yet a very modern way at the same time. Conservative in the sense that he knew how to activate different social networks, clans, kinship networks. He had an understanding of the social map that was fascinating. He also knew how to conduct personal politics really well and would use all sorts of tricks to be able to mobilize on that level, often very successful ones. He knew how to deal with the authorities really well. Quite a talented organizer, total workaholic, had strange working hours, always. But he managed to galvanize around him basically students that were resistant to ideas of absorbing Palestinian politics into broader Arab politics or communist politics. So he's essentially relying on a different kind of base than that was promoted by the movement of Arab nationalists or the Baathists or the communists. These were his competitors in student elections. He strikes good deals with the Muslim Brotherhood because he was an engineering student at King Fouad University, which becomes like Cairo University after the 52 revolution. He's not a Muslim brother officially, but he's close to some of them. Now, the interesting thing with that phenomena is that he's relying also on his network from Gaza, which I say it quite a bit these days. I remind people of this, which has a disproportionate weight in Palestinian politics at this stage, because it's the only part of Palestine that you could say you're Palestinian in this stage. The majority of Palestine fell under the Israeli state, and people were now oppressed, and they couldn't say that they're Palestinian.
And much of the rest was annexed by Jordan.
Exactly.
And then Gaza was Egypt administered, but not annexed.
Exactly. So in Gaza, you could say, I'm Palestinian. And after, of course, as far as the Egyptians were concerned, they did accept the formation of what was called the All Palestine government, which was a state of Palestine that was declared in Gaza. Its capital was supposed to be Jerusalem, but it was, of course, in Gaza that was initially able to establish itself during the 48 war. But of course, it was a ill-fated experiment because King Abdullah of Jordan made sure that it would be combated on an Arab level. So it never gained recognition. And that's why you didn't end up with a Palestine on the map in part, something that people like Yasser Arafat and others were very bitter about, and that becomes a big theme within what people sometimes refer to as Palestinian nationalism. I don't like that term, by the way, very much, because I think it's more Palestinian patriotism, but I don't think there was ever a current that really sought to completely detach Palestine from Arab or other surroundings. Palestinians were much more regionally integrated than most others in this region, including, by the way, the group that coalesced around Yasser Arafat, which became later on Fatah. Okay, so we have this group emerging in Cairo, and it's mostly students from Gaza, but also other parts of Palestine that ended up in Cairo. The phenomena of going to study in Cairo even grows. Initially the bulk of the students come from Gaza, but then you have all these students that are coming from everywhere, from Jordan, elsewhere, because of scholarships offered by Nasser and free education offered by Nasser. And this is, again, when we're talking about these developments that are going on, I don't think we can underestimate the importance for the working class, but also for refugee communities and other marginalized communities in the region of the progressive economic changes taking place in the surrounding Arab region, including under Nasser, of course. So while we should understand his limits in that he didn't pursue full communism, but he gave a lot of scholarships for a lot of people, and including a lot of Palestinian students that benefited from it. But of course, a lot benefited from Iraq and elsewhere. So we can talk about that later on. But you have these student bodies emerging, and they're coming in with all sorts of ideas. Some, as I said, around Yasser Arafat, like Salah Khalaf, who becomes Abu Iyad. He's somebody who was a Muslim brother, Kader. Later on, he becomes, by the way, closer to, he becomes more left-leaning in Fatah, but that was his original background, was Muslim brother organizer. There were other people like, Abu al-Adib, other figures like that were also Muslim brother organizers. And Yasser Arafat relied upon them as he mobilized people in Cairo. He also relied on establishing good connections with the heads of the Muslim Brotherhood youth in Gaza itself. And that includes people that were not necessarily fellows in college with him in Egypt, but that were effective in organizing the youth in Gaza. So Khalil Wazir, Abu Jihad, who becomes his number 2 in Fatah, is one of those characters. These figures establish a network. They establish personal networks. And these networks later on get activated at different moments. So I'll give you an example. The most important leader in the Women's Union, the Secretary General of the Women's Union for a long time, was also a wonderful poet. And, by the way, I was devastated this year when she passed away, because she was a dear friend also, May Sayegh, an incredible example and a wonderful revolutionary in every sense of the term. She had encountered them as a student in Cairo as well, from Gaza. And initially at the stage, she was not with the Muslim Brotherhood at all. She was actually with the Ba'ath. Initially, she was a communist, then shifted to the Ba'ath. People, by the way, used to shift also formations. Okay, she comes from a Christian background, so she wasn't going to join the Muslim Brotherhood. She had good relations with them. And she liked Abu Iyad because he was the president of Rabitat Talabat Palestine. So later on, they reconnected many years later, around 67, and he asked her, "Do you remember me, May?" Initially, she didn't know how he looked like. He looked older and he bolder, and but she's like, "Oh yeah, of course." And that becomes then a connection that allows and facilitates her entry into a leading role in Fatah. So all what I'm saying is these networks play a big role in this initial moment. Now, what's interesting about the network that establishes Fatah is that most of its members were either old Muslim brothers or Baathists in the original formation, and then with a splintering of communists. Not that many came from movement of Arab nationalist backgrounds. Movement of Arab nationalists takes its own trajectory, and it becomes, later on in the 60s, becomes a competing structure. These become competing structures. And we can talk about that later on.
What's happening elsewhere across the region among Palestinian refugees, and how do all these geographically dispersed circles begin to intersect?
We have the Gaza network. We've just described it. It's centered around Cairo. There's another network that's operating and beginning to emerge, and that's in Damascus. And that's another space where you can have some space for Palestine work. Because the Syrian environment was more open to Palestinian refugees, it was not opposed to all sorts of organizing. There were moments, as we mentioned, in which there was democratic freedoms in Syria and people could be involved in political life. And a lot of Palestinians in Syria became active, of course, in pan-Arab movements and, of course, in also internationalist movements like the communists. But you had this wing and that either entered pan-Islamic work through the Brotherhood or through Hizb al-Tahrir. Those guys, initially, they had some talented organizers. There were some Tahriris and Muslim Brothers that later became very important figures in Fatah, including the head of Fatah Foreign Relations for a long time, who was, from the Al-Hassan family. There were the Khalid al-Hassan, his brother Hani al-Hassan. These were all involved in Islamic politics in refugee camps in Syria. But also you had a more secular wing that was centered around student society in high schools that felt that Palestinian voices needed their own space, Palestinian space. And these were people that founded something called Arab Palestine, which is the Arabs of Palestine. It was like a young student movement without that many members. We're talking about like a couple dozen, but they become influential figures in the Fatah movement. And, they developed their own network. One of them is Hayal Abdel Hamid, for example. There are many others that belong to this kind of network. Some of them later joined the Ba'ath, some of them later joined other parties, but they've had an experience of organizing in a Palestinian circle as Palestinians. And this becomes an important theme for most people who join Fatah later on or who create Fatah later on. Now, the interesting thing is when you have the Cairo network merging with the Damascus network, and that takes place in Kuwait, because everybody goes to work in Kuwait, having lost everything. The way forward for you is to gain an education, and the best prospect is end up working in Kuwait or Saudi Arabia or somewhere. So you have a group of people from Cairo and Damascus backgrounds ending up in Kuwait. Some end up in Saudi Arabia in the eastern region in Aramco. And these include some prominent figures in Fatah later on, like some founding members like Gamal Udwan, others. And then you have a group in Qatar, including the unfortunate current president of Palestine, Abu Mazen, who I would say is a disgrace to any revolutionary tradition. But, he was in the Qatar group and he joined fairly early on. He comes from the Damascus experience. Abu Mazen's family is from Safad. They ended up being expelled to Damascus, to Syria. So you have these networks emerging, and essentially the main figures that play a key role in the founding is one figure that now is completely erased from memory, a guy called Adel Abdel Karim. He became later on a professor of mathematics. He dropped out from the movement as a result of a conflict with Yasser Arafat fairly early on. But he had met with Yasser Arafat, and they essentially brought the two networks together, because Adel Abdel Karim had the Damascus crew around him, and Arafat had a Cairo crew around him. And I want to emphasize this because there are those conspiracy theorists that tell you Arafat had nothing to do with the founding, whatever. It's actually not true. I've done a lot of research on this, Daniel, like primary research. I've interviewed hundreds of people and, looked at countless documents. It's like, there's no question about it. He played a key role. And if you go to the earliest iterations, these were the two key figures. But then, of course, Khalil Wazir plays a key role as well. And then a guy who was from Adel Abdel Karim's side, from Damascus, Abdullah Dannan, who became a well-known linguist later on. He left with Adel later on. These four used to be referred to in Fatah circles as the four big ones, the big four.
So what's the vision and the strategy for Palestinian liberation that these four big ones, the key founders of Fatah, put forward? What's their revolutionary theory of how the decolonization of Palestine will happen?
So in those initial years, the initial proposal that Yasser Arafat had come to, and he was, again, an engineer working in Kuwait at the stage. Adil Abdel Karim was a teacher working there. The initial proposal was, look, there's the Algerian Revolution going on, and the Algerian Revolution becomes the model for it. What fascinates them about it is the idea that armed struggle plays a key role. So this is very different than the movement of Arab nationalist theory. Movement of Arab nationalists, they want to revolutionize the Arab world so that the Arab states could become strong and united and build military power through which they would be able to liberate Palestine. Because their view was, you cannot confront the Zionist military machine with the support of all the Western states without a strong regional army. That's the only way, and a unified one. They attributed the loss of Palestine to the weakness of Arab armies, but also the weakness of Arab states and the weakness of their social base. So they wanted a complete overhaul of the regional system so as to create the conditions that would allow for a liberation of Palestine that would be carried out principally by Arab militaries. That was the movement of Arab nationalist traditional view. That was a lot of Baathists thought like that back in the day as well. But when it came to the Fatah crew, their view was it should be like Algeria. The Palestinian people need to liberate Palestine because the loss of Palestine came as a result of the Arab armies coming in, disarming the people of Palestine, not supporting them in protecting themselves, their villages, their towns and cities during the Nakba. Instead of helping them develop fighting capacity, they left them vulnerable to settler colonist attacks under the guise of them facilitating their protection. But in reality, the Arab armies will follow the regional interests of the state they represent. That was the Fatah view. That was a view of people like Yasser Arafat, like Adil Abdel Karim and others. And therefore, they were like, what we need is something like Algeria, where the FLN takes the lead, Arab states provide it with the support. And in the case of Algeria, of course, you had Morocco opening up its borders and Tunisia opening up its borders for the FLN to be able to actually liberate Algeria from outside as well as from inside. So their theory was that's the role of the Arab states. Arm the revolution, arm the armed struggle, and through that you will have the liberation of Palestine on the hands of its people.
Earlier in the interview, you mentioned that refugees in the years after the Nakba attempted to return home to homes that they'd been expelled from within what was now the state of Israel. What did that look like, and how did the Israeli state respond?
So you generally had attempts to cross the border from many people who had become refugees. Some of these succeeded, many of them failed. So you had this period in the early 50s when there was still hope of success. There were individual cases, especially right after the 48 war and in the very beginning of the 1950s, including, by the way, the family of Palestine's most renowned author and poet, Mahmoud Darwish. His family actually went back to their village after having been expelled, and after having crossed the border, they decided to go back. Another case that's interesting is members of the Usbat al-Taharrur al-Watani, the National Liberation League, which later became the leadership of the Communist Party, the Palestinian side of the leadership of the Israeli Communist Party. They were communists that had went to Beirut, and these include famous people like Emil Touma and Emil Habibi. They crossed the border to Lebanon, but then they actually came back. Of course, they were arrested and interrogated, but then their fellow Communist Party comrades, their Jewish comrades, removed them, found a way to release them. But these were exceptional cases. For the most part, the majority of refugees were not able to go back, and that's the big story, the vast majority. And they were demanding repatriation. And they found ways to make their voices heard, despite the fact that to this day, there are attempts to erase their voices. And to this day, there is an attempt to cancel out the category of Palestinian refugee. And they're playing games nowadays, Daniel. People like Jared Kushner and others in coordination with Netanyahu are trying to cancel this category. And we're seeing this now in Gaza because they're saying these are descendants of refugees. Actually, under international law, even the descendants of the people that were expelled continue to be refugees anywhere in the world until there's a political settlement of their situation, until they go back home. Now, in the 50s, these refugees were talking amongst themselves on what is to be done. That's why they founded all of these different formations. Some of these formations had a Palestinian-only emphasis, and that was seen in these various youth groups and in these various circles that we talked about in Damascus, in Cairo, especially amongst the student movements. But then you also had movements that took a different kind of orientation. So you had the Muslim Brotherhood trend, especially in Gaza, it was strong, but also on the Jordanian side, it was encouraged by the state on the Jordanian side. In Gaza, it was strong because of Gaza's proximity to Egypt, and Egypt is where the Muslim Brotherhood was born, and also because people were impressed by the fact that the Egyptian Muslim Brothers had sent volunteers to fight alongside the Palestinians during the 1948 war. So there was an initial attraction, but they had a problem with their youth wing. And the youth wing was led at the time, the student side of the Ikhwan, of the Muslim Brotherhood, was led by a young man called Khalil Wazir, Abu Jihad, later on to be called Abu Jihad. And he became the number 2 in Fatah under Yasser Arafat. Abu Jihad was saying from the early 1950s, he and other youth joined the Brotherhood because they believed that it might help liberate Palestine. But then they found out that the Brotherhood leadership was calling essentially for a more quietist approach. They were saying that what we need now is to mobilize for da'wah, for spreading the Islamic word, and for reforming the self, rather than immediately mobilizing to fight against the dispossession of the people and the usurpation of their lands.
It's a sort of religious conservative outlook that says we need to turn towards God and become a holy people to sort of merit winning Palestine back. And it's sort of the turning away from God that allowed for Palestine to be taken in the first place.
That's a big part of it. And the other part is you need to have the organizational infrastructure and the deep social work to be able to have a solid base. Now, to be fair to the Brotherhood, they know how to create a solid base as a result of this kind of work, because their type of politics is very much initially connected to social work. They spent a lot of time on establishing charities, medical, youth support centers, different kinds of educational initiatives. And that means that they have a strong basis in society around, of course, the institution of the mosque as well.
In prior episodes, we talked about how they were the masters of the war of position.
Mm-hmm. Very, very true. And this was fine, but it was not serving them well in the Palestinian arena at this stage in the early 50s, because you had a general mood that was saying, we want to liberate the land. Remember, the Nakba had just happened, if you're in 1954 and you're one of these youth, and the Nakba had just happened a few years ago. If you're in 1954 Gaza and you're one of these youth, let's say you're Abu Jihad, you will be very well aware of the fact that there are constant Israeli attacks on Gaza under the guise of protecting the state of Israel from infiltrators, what they called infiltrators, which were, of course, refugees that they had expelled and that were trying to go back to their lands. Or refugees that were expelled and were trying to do actual cross-border operations on an individual initiative to avenge their losses. And that was very minor. I mean, you had some minor cross-border operations that were going on, people like Abu Jihad started organizing some of these. And they focused, by the way, on sabotage operations. So they would go into these nearby kibbutzes that stole lands from the Palestinians that were expelled into Gaza, and they would sabotage the water tanks, they would sabotage the network. They were mainly engaging in sabotage operations because the idea was to disrupt the normalcy of life for the settler colonists so as to delay the settler colonization of that area. That was the idea at the time.
I'm Astra Taylor, and you're listening to The Dig with Daniel Denver, a podcast that helps us understand the past so we can organize for a better future. That's why you should support the show at patreon.com/thedig.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is How to Abolish Prisons, Lessons from the Movement Against Imprisonment by Rachel Hertzing and Justin Piche. Critics of abolition sometimes castigate the movement for its utopianism, but in this book, longtime organizers Hertzing and Piche reveal a movement that has made the struggle for abolition as real as the institutions that it fights against. Drawing on extensive interviews with abolitionist crews all over North America, they provide a stunning snapshot of a movement's thinking and organizing in motion. As Maya Shenwar puts it, this illuminating, grounded documentation of real efforts to dismantle carceral systems makes liberatory visions tangible. How to Abolish Prisons is an antidote to hopelessness. Find How to Abolish Prisons at haymarketbooks.org, where all paperback books are 20% off every day. What role did armed struggle play over the 1950s? As we've discussed before, Palestinian organizing was particularly intense in Gaza, and we've discussed multiple times how that remains true and remains true through today. But during this period, there were also violent Israeli reprisals that targeted Gaza, attacks on Egyptian soldiers and on Palestinians, including, during the Suez aggression, the summary execution of hundreds of Palestinians. How did these sort of sporadic Fedayeen attacks in Israel from Gaza and also from elsewhere, how did those emerge over the course of that decade? And what role did those armed actions play in beginning to cohere the Palestinian struggle as a national liberation movement?
So we have the beginnings of armed struggle in different locations. We have initiatives coming out of Gaza, and these are carried out by different people, including Abu Jihad, who we mentioned, who became the number 2 in Fatah. He had organized the youth wing of the Muslim Brothers, and they were beginning to attack certain installations, carrying out sabotage operations across the border. They were confronting also the fact that Israel was constantly engaging in a strategy of attacking Gaza in a very heavy-handed way. And the Israeli overall outlook is similar to that of a bully, basically, on a playground. If the young kid they beat up tries to touch them a little bit, they will go and punch them and throw them to the ground. And they call that deterrence. Of course, it's not deterrence or self-defense or anything like that, because they're the aggressive power that had expelled all these people. It's basically telling people, do not dare defend yourselves, because if you defend yourself, we will wipe you off the map. That's always been their strategy and outlook. And one of the main people that was propagating that line in that period was, of course, Ariel Sharon. And another person behind the scenes that was supporting him in this strategy was Ben Gurion himself. So there is a lot of great research on this, detailed research. Avi Shlaim has done a lot of work on the 50s and Israeli strategies around that within the government and different positions around that. But what I want to emphasize here from our end is in 1955, they commit horrific massacres in Khan Yunis, and they all actually go and attack the hospital there. You know, they've been attacking hospitals for a long time. It's actually disgusting. Even as early as 1955, they went and attacked the hospital in Khan Yunis. And this led then the Egyptians to develop a strategy through a man that they had sent in Gaza to carry out operations of a limited nature. But these were operations that entailed elements of armed struggle, but under the control of Egyptian intelligence. So this man was called Mustafa Hafiz, and he's a very well-known figure in Gaza specifically, and Palestine more generally. He's an Egyptian officer, and he trained some Palestinians from Gaza alongside others from the Egyptian army that he saw as overseeing these operations. And they started to do operations across the border, basically. That meant that, the Israelis were going to try to, of course, get rid of this man. And they did. They assassinated him. So often when we speak of Palestinian armed struggle, we refer to Mustafa Hafiz as one of the early instances where Palestinians were trained and organized post the Nakba. Nevertheless, this was not free Palestinian action. This was under the close watch of Egyptian authorities. But it did impact Palestinians because it made them feel like, yes, we are capable of being trained. We are capable of being armed. If only the Arab states would let us. And they're not letting us do that. And at the time, everybody understood that there's no way that people will be able to voluntarily admitted in by the Israeli state back to their homes and lands, or that they will ever be able to have a political future or equality or the ability to have self-determination as a people. They won't have national or political rights just because the Israeli state is trying to be good or charitable. That's not going to happen out of charity. The feeling was the Israeli state was created by violence, immense amounts of violence. So that required then the ability to counter that pressure militarily. That's the only way forward. So a military solution was the only solution that people could envision. There was no peaceful pathway that they could envision for the Israelis to accept a return of Palestinian refugees or their ability to have self-determination on their land from which they were expelled. So unlike Americans or Europeans who decided, oh yeah, the people are expelled now, so therefore they don't need to have any political or national rights on that land. They didn't share that view. They're like, we come from there. This is our land. And just because the Americans or Europeans decided that it should be given to Europeans that have just arrived on it, for whatever reason they want to call it, whether it's a humanitarian reason or whether it's any other reason, does not mean that we share that vision. So that was the Palestinian outlook at the time. Now, some parties, and I've mentioned this before, especially the pan-Arabist ones, were saying, let's wait until the Arab states unite and they develop armed capacity to liberate Palestine. Others were less convinced of this approach. And the people that joined, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood youth, like Khalil Wazir, they had anyways a contentious understanding of the Arab regimes. They were suspicious because anybody who was in the Muslim Brotherhood after the drama that happened between them and Nasser in the early 50s, they were not very enthusiastic about the idea or the prospect that the Egyptian government was going to liberate Palestine. So unlike, for example, the movement of Arab nationalists, which become Nasserist, or get attracted to Nasserism from the mid-50s onwards, people who went through the Muslim Brotherhood experience were more suspicious. They did not have much faith in, obviously, the Arab regimes that were tied to the imperial powers either. So their view was self-sufficiency is the only way forward. But they didn't have a working formula for achieving that. This meant that they were trying to use the brotherhood structure to achieve that self-sufficiency, but they clashed with the more conservative brotherhood leaderships. And that's exactly what happened with Khalil Wazir and some of his other brothers that were around him from the Muslim Brotherhood. They actually penned a famous letter, famous within brotherhood circles at the time, complaining to the leadership about the lack of arming the youth and lack of interest in armed struggle and the lack of interest in liberating Palestine or working towards liberating Palestine through direct armed struggle. So eventually they actually leave the brotherhood. And a lot of the people that left the brotherhood end up playing a big role in the foundation of Fatah. They're joined by people that left other major parties at the time. So there were people that left the Ba'ath in 1959 over the split within the Ba'ath around the United Arab Republic. And that's a story that we will get into with more detail later on, but it's relevant to the narrative we're talking about now, because the Palestinian slash Jordanian branch of the Ba'ath Party actually rejected the change in policy within the Ba'ath towards the United Arab Republic. Michel Aflaq initially starts being very enthusiastic about unity with Egypt, but then when he sees that Nasser did not give him enough space in the government, ends up rebelling against that.
When they realized that when Nasser said, I'm going to be running the show, there'll be no political parties, he wasn't joking.
He was not joking. So what that meant was that you had Baathists that left the Ba'ath Party over the demand of Michel Aflaq to work against the United Arab Republic. This split was actually carried out by the leader of the Jordanian Palestinian branch, Abdullah Rimawi, and others. Now, Rimawi stayed at the Ba'athist and he went to Cairo, sought refuge with Nasser. But there were some of the younger cadres that were kind of lost. And they were also beginning to be attracted to the idea that was developing in the late 1950s of the need for self-sufficiency and Palestinian armed struggle to develop along Palestinian national lines. Now, here, again, we spoke about Yasser Arafat meeting Adel Abdel Karim and telling him we need something like the Algerian Revolution. They did that meeting in Kuwait. But what we did not mention is that all of them were actually inspired by the earlier incidents, like the creation of the Mustafa Hafiz units and their operations inside occupied territories, or what became known as the State of Israel. And they were inspired by the operations of Khalil Wazir, the early ones at Sabotage on the part of the Muslim Brotherhood youth. They were also inspired by an important model that happened during the Israeli invasion of Gaza and the Sinai in 1956. Because when they invaded Gaza and the Sinai, in Gaza, there was a popular front that was founded.
It was Brotherhood and Communist.
Yes, and you had Baathists as well doing their own experiments to a lesser extent. But the Brotherhood and the Communists played a role in organizing actions. And, they had experimented before in an earlier Gaza Intifada at some joint work. So you had different resistance operations going on in 1956 that inspired the idea that Palestinians can resist by themselves without Arab regimes. There was no Arab regime involved in coordinating that resistance. That's why I always tell people Gaza was very important for the development of the Palestinian struggle because of that particularity. Now, given the accumulation of these experiences, the idea that you will have an Algerian model applied to Palestine, because Palestinians were looking at Algeria, they were like, why is it that the Arab states are okay with supporting our Algerian sisters and brothers, allowing them to have their own leadership, allowing the Arab regime's role to be restricted to providing arms and diplomatic support and operational support and so on,
and respecting the Algerians' political independence as leaders of their own national liberation struggle.
Correct. Whereas in Palestine, they intervene in everything. They don't allow the people to arm itself. They don't allow the people to organize itself. And of course, the answer from the Arab states' perspective is clear, is that most of these Arab states were worried about this very aggressive settler colonial state attacking them. And they were tied to the imperial powers with a range of shackling, restrictions in the case of states of Jordan and earlier on monarchical Iraq and, other states of that sort. So there's this worry.
As we already know from Egypt-administered Gaza, and as we'll find out in future episodes about other countries that are bordering Israel, that indeed sheltering Palestinian Fedayeen or guerrilla fighters of any sort does invite Israeli reprisals.
Yes, because that's the whole Israeli strategy. You can call it the bully strategy, you can call it raging bull strategy, whatever you want to call it. It's saying, if you allow these people to carry out a single operation, if you help them in any way, let alone actually supporting them, if they even do stuff under the table without you knowing and you're not suppressing it, we will come back at you and harm you So it is this very aggressive, and of course it's facilitated by the fact that the Israeli state is armed in very strong ways by the Western camp at this stage. And they have these silly arguments of people who don't know their history or who claim to know history, Daniel, that are saying, well, the Americans were not doing the supplies, and it's just the French at this stage. Just because the Air Force is using French planes does not mean that the United States is not standing behind the state of Israel at this stage. It's offering it immense advantages in indirect ways and under the table. It's a very important and key relationship that's already there in place. And certainly the British, even though they claim that they're involved with the Arab states and they're somehow this neutral party, that's not the truth. They provide immense services for the Israeli state, including, by the way, in the 1950s, all these states are quietly helping Israel with a nuclear program. They're providing it with heavy water. They're providing it with, they're turning a blind eye to the enrichment of uranium. And sometimes they're directly knowledgeable about this developing, but they don't care. This nuclear program is a big part of the story. And of course, the Western camp is also funding this project, and partly, through direct and indirect ways. So when it comes to the Palestinians, they're worried about all of this, and they're saying, look, we need to do something. Now, some of them, as we said, believed that if you unite the Arab world, if you liberate the Arab world and unite it, then you will liberate Palestine. That's always been the strategy of the movement of Arab nationalists. And later on, it becomes the strategy of its offshoot, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And if you notice, even if you look at the Popular Front's logo, it has the map of Palestine and then the surrounding Arab region, and there is an arrow that goes into Palestine from the Arab region. And that's basically their view. Fatah, or what becomes Fatah, has a different outlook. It's saying we need the Algerian model. We need to start like the FLN, Front de Libération Nationale. We need a National Liberation Front in Palestine. That's why they call themselves Harakat Taharrur Watani Palestini, Palestinian National Liberation Movement, Fatah. Fatah is basically an inversion of the first letters of these words in Arabic. Fatah is a victory. It signifies victory. So it's a nice name.
Given the history that we've already discussed and the history that we will be discussing over future episodes, what was the significance of Fatah's formation? What did it signal about the institutionalization of the Palestinian cause as a proper national liberation movement led by Palestinians?
So what it signified was a few things. One is an emphasis that you will not have the liberation of Palestine on the part of the Arab states. It will have to be carried out by its own people. And secondly, and this becomes like a key principle in Fatah politics. Secondly, they're emphasizing that they don't want to intervene in the internal politics of the Arab states. And that becomes like an axiom of Fatah politics. These, by the way, main principles are articulated in two early documents that are published in 58, 59, and they're the foundational documents in the history of Fatah. The Haykal al-Bina al-Thawri and Bayan Harakatuna. So you have the edifice of revolutionary construction and our movement, or the communique of our movement, Bayan Harakatuna, the manifesto of our movement. And in both of these documents, you see that there's initially like these preambles that talk about the dispossession of the Palestinian people, the fact that they've suffered from this dispersion, and that the Arab states, instead of supporting them, they mistreated them during that process. There's a lot about the Arab states here. And that's because they want to communicate this idea that you will get nothing from the dependency on the Arab states. At the same time, and this is something I want to emphasize, when people say that these were Palestinian nationalists and they contrast them with pan-Arabists, I actually disagree with that interpretation. That's the prevalent interpretation in the literature. But my own historical intervention, which I'm working on in my current book, actually illustrates that these people ideologically were not necessarily opposed to Arab unity or the incorporation of Palestine into a broader Arab project. They did not have an idea of a separate Palestinian nationalism necessarily.
It was more a strategic assessment of, look, we've seen what we've gotten from the Arab states who claim to be the leaders of the struggle for our liberation, and it hasn't worked for the following reasons.
Exactly. It was a complete lack of faith in the ability of Arab governments. And you see that this actually becomes very important for Fatah, especially after the fall of the United Arab Republic, because initially, you have this wave of enthusiasm when the United Arab Republic is formed. People think, look, now the moment of liberation has come closer than ever. You have the two most important Arab states that are bordering this settler colonial state of Israel have united. And people were even making like all the historical analogies to Salah ad-Din and the Crusades, when Salah ad-Din united Egypt and Syria, that's when he was able to liberate Jerusalem from the Crusaders. There's this whole like long history of thinking that Palestine is, of course, essentially tied to Egypt and Syria and what happens in them. And of course, that's true. Historically, even long before, the Roman period, even these two countries have big influence on Palestine. What happens in the surrounding region is very important. However, the folks that come to form what is Fatah don't have much faith in that worldview that somehow the UAR is going to save everything. And even if it did, in their view, the leadership should be in Palestinian hands, because that's the only leadership that it will be trusted to continue the path and not liquidate the cause. In that period, that was the thinking. That Arab states had betrayed the cause in the Rhodes armistice agreements. At the end of the day, these states will act in accordance with their national interests, not with the interests of the Palestinian people, even if more revolutionary governments are in charge.
And I think it's worth repeating and reemphasizing here how important the Algerian model is and how important Algeria is, how iconic it is, not only throughout the entire Arab world, Mashriq and Maghreb, but globally as a standard bearer of revolutionary decolonization.
Right. Absolutely. And here, the importance of Algeria manifests itself in an additional dimension. Aside from the idea of the Arab states and Palestinian relationship to them, who should be in the leadership role? Is it the Palestinian movement or the Arab states? Does the Palestinian movement follow a revolutionary Arab state model under the leadership of Nasser, or does it actually form its own independent pathway? The Fatah answered in the affirmative to the second question. It basically also advocated the Algerian model when it came to the question of armed struggle. It was saying we have to center armed struggle because that's the only way to actually develop the capacity of the people to be able to get its land back. And this assessment that Fatah had was based on a theory of how occupied countries get liberated. They even had a famous pamphlet that they issued in 1965, and they presented actually in an Afro-Asian conference in Algiers in 1965, and it was called the Liberation of Occupied Countries. So we have, sorry, in 1967. So the idea was you have this notion of a theory of the liberation of occupied countries and territories that was based on this notion of the armed struggle is the only way forward. Colonialism does not understand any other language. That was the emphasis that they placed on this. This meant that much of the concern in the early years of Fatah was on developing the capacity to launch an armed struggle. And they did that through establishing initially clandestine networks, spreading their ideas around the betrayal of Arab states, their failure in leading the Palestinian struggle, and the need for self-dependency and armed struggle. And they did that through a publication that they formed in Beirut that was called Palestinuna, Our Palestine, Palestinuna Nida'ul Haya, the call to life. So Palestinuna was a publication through which they propagated these ideas. And it was incidentally, and this is why I tell people you have to be careful about saying Fatah is a just Palestinian nationalism. Actually, the editors were Lebanese of Palestinuna. And Hani Fakhouri, who I had the pleasure of meeting in Beirut before he passed away, was basically writing most of the articles there. And he later on became a bank manager in Beirut. But in his early years, he was a volunteer in that publication. And it was registered under the name of a Lebanese printmaker, Tawfiq Houri. He owned a printer shop, and it was registered under his name. So this is how the movement initially started. They were spreading that magazine secretly. They were having meetings, clandestine meetings, especially in the Gulf. And they were beginning to establish branches in Syria and Jordan to prepare the work and lay down the foundation for a future armed struggle. And that took them a few years. It took them about, from the moment they kind of really formalized their being around 1959 to the launch of armed struggle in 1965, it was like about 6 years of preparation. Of course, there's many different stories about that. And nowadays in Fatah, everybody tries to take credit for who was there in these early years, the years in the lead up to what they called the first intilaqa, the first launch, because they had a few launches. The first one was in 1965, but then they had the second one after 1967 that we can talk about later on. So yeah, this was a period of major buildup around Fatah, but it was done in a very secret way.
We discussed their Algeria, and obviously this series, just by necessity, has to have some parameters. So we're focusing overwhelmingly on the Mashriq, but we do have to keep referencing the Maghreb. And before we move on, I do want to ask, aside from Algeria, what sort of role is being played both in the Palestinian national liberation movement that's developing in the 1950s and also more broadly Arab politics by the anti-colonial politics that we're seeing also in Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, within Morocco, Western Sahara, that's a complicated one, and then Sudan, which until the early 50s, or maybe mid-1950s, had been part of Egypt, and where there's an incredibly strong communist tradition. The Maghreb is just absolutely full of radical anti-colonial politics.
Yeah, so there's not only like influences, there are direct connections. I mentioned in a previous episode, there was in Cairo, the Bureau of the Arab Maghreb. And that bureau was basically coordinating solidarity with the Maghreb states from across the Arab world. One of the main people from the Palestinian side that was very active in that bureau was actually Yasser Arafat's brother. That created a long-standing relationship with the FLN that was to come to fruition after the independence of Algeria. But Palestinian movements were very active in the solidarity movement with the Arab Maghreb, which meant at this stage basically the movement to allow for the independence of Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria from France. In Morocco and Tunisia, we know that independence took a different trajectory because France never annexed those territories. They were never counted as part of France in a formal sense. Whereas Algeria, if you looked at any French map in this period, they would count Algeria as part of France. And also Morocco and Tunisia, of course, had local dynasties that were still ruling them officially under French control and tutelage. And we've talked a little bit about this in the past, but essentially the independence movements in Morocco and in Tunisia are successful, and this creates the impression that the anti-colonial tide is rising. Okay, but the governments that come out of these movements are not necessarily of a revolutionary nature. So Bourguiba can at best, who leads the Tunisian struggle, he at best can be described as a liberal essentially, and he wants close relations with the West, and he was a Francophile, he's into ideas of Westernization and so on, and that's all fine. But like it's a different model than the anti-colonial one that is characteristic of that period. Despite the fact that he did lead a successful independence struggle, and of course he had respect in the initial years, but his views start diverging from those of the Palestinian movement fairly early on. On the Moroccan side, you end up with a monarchical ruling family, which is also closely aligned to the West, which is very strongly anti-communist, which actually even assassinated major communist figures like Mahdi bin Barka, for example, with actually collaboration from the Israeli Mossad. So you have all of these strange intersections between governments like that, which for the most part were considered by the Arab left. They were categorized as part of what they called the Arab reaction. So the main enemy of liberation in the Arab world at this stage was identified by the Arab left as the triumvirate of Western imperialism, settler colonial Zionism, Israeli settler colonial Zionism, and Arab reactionary regimes. They were seeing it as actually a triumvirate that was interlinked and was manifesting itself as a project for the domination of the region that had interlinked features.
And this is looking quite a bit ahead, but we should note in terms of the reactionary nature of Morocco's regime that in 1975, I believe, Morocco seizes Western Sahara as its own colony.
Yes. So in the case of Morocco, it has its own agendas. It has its own extractive ambitions for Western Sahara, largely because of its mineral resources. But of course, it does that under the banner of national unification ideology that the ruling family propagates at this stage. So, and that's been a successful strategy for them within Morocco. They presented the project to annex Western Sahara and take it over as somehow restoring unity to an area that was divided by colonialism. Now, of course, that version of events was rejected by the people in Western Sahara who were saying, look, maybe under different conditions, if Morocco did not have a monarchical regime, if it was a different kind of environment, maybe we could consider options of unity. But first, you need to have self-determination for the people of Western Sahara, and they need to be able to benefit from their own mineral resources. So that problem, of course, was in many ways created by Western colonialism, but they're all interrelated, of course.
Let's finish this episode by talking about Palestinian politics within this new Zionist entity, the newly established state of Israel, established, of course, through the mass dispossession, ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. What do Palestinian politics look like throughout the 1950s, a period that is a period of military rule for Palestinian citizens of Israel? Is the Israeli Communist Party, which before the Nakba was the Palestine Communist Party, was the Israeli Communist Party during this period the main political force representing Palestinians in Israel?
Yes. So after the Nakba, you had a disastrous situation where the Palestinians that remained on their lands after the 1948 war, which led to basically the loss of the majority of Palestinian lands around them, as well as the majority of their people. Now, two things that we should notice here sociologically. One is all the Palestinian cities had been destroyed in 1948 or taken over completely. And that meant that with the exception of Nazareth, you did not have a majority Palestinian Arab city within the Israeli state after 1948. And Nazareth was, by the way, a smaller city. It was a tiny place. And it survived pretty much only because of its religious significance for Christians. Had it not been, that important, the Israelis may have probably would have depopulated it as they did to other places. So this was a population that was conquered, that was put under very harsh military rule and martial law. Every Palestinian community within the boundary of the Israeli state was under the mercy of a military official that decided everything, every little detail of daily life. They could control it. They could, and they did, for example, do things like tell people, okay, you're going to have to stand by this tree from now until the sunset. And you can't say no. They could and did disrupt teaching in classrooms. They could and did intervene in every little detail of life. It was basically military occupation. And that only was removed pretty much by the 1966. So you had like years of military rule.
And as was discussed really extensively at the recent World Academic Forum for Palestine, Israel, following in the footsteps of the British Mandate, also aggressively prevented the emergence of any sort of Palestinian academic or intellectual life, attempted to preempt it from happening.
Yes, and that was a point that was emphasized in the World Academic Forum by Ilan Pape, who of course knows exactly what he's talking about. He's been studying this phenomenon for a very long time. Yeah, they've imposed a system of intellectual restrictions, attacks on Palestinian thought and education, and that continues to this very day. By the way, one of the few Palestinian professors in Israeli universities today, for example, is a dear and wonderful friend, Nadir Shalhoub Kevorkian, who just got released now, Daniel, from a horrific interrogation she was placed under, where she received denial of medicine, complete medical negligence, and total harassment and shackling and being put in urine-infested places. It was disgusting what they done to her. But that's all to prevent Palestinians from talking about their issues. That's all because she's been actually trying to work on stopping the genocide in Gaza. And there's very few Palestinian professors in Israeli universities to this day. Now, at the moment that we were talking about, there were none. And the cities had been destroyed, as I mentioned. The traditional leaderships of this community had been expelled. What you had was basically a community that was left to fend for itself without any of the political foundations for survival. The only organized force that was capable of operating at the time was the Communist Party, because you couldn't organize this community along Palestinian national lines. You couldn't organize it along agendas of any other previous Palestinian party that had existed before. The communists were allowed to operate because the Communist Party was an Israeli party. And there was a demand from within that party to restore the old unity that had existed in the party between the Jewish cadres and the Palestinian ones. Now, that unity had collapsed formally in 1943 with the establishment of the National Liberation League that the Palestinians had founded. It collapsed formally. Already it had many problems during the Great Revolt, and there were already starting to be dynamics even earlier, But by the time we hit 1943, there's this big cleavage that grows between the Zionist, or what's seen as a Zionist tendency amongst the Jewish members on the part of the Arab members, or Palestinian members. And those two wings of the party do not reconcile until after the Nakba, when Zionism became a fait accompli. The establishment of the State of Israel became there. It was created. So there was no point in communists having the debates that they were having earlier, because the main debate that the Jewish cadres and the Arab cadres were having in 43 when they broke up essentially was over whether there should be a state, a Palestinian state, with citizenship rights for everybody, regardless of their background. And that was the Arab position, but based on a democratic process, or if there should be a binational state that recognizes a dual nationality, the existence of two nationalisms, which was the demand of the Jewish cadres. So the Arab cadres were accusing the Jewish cadres of denying the settler colonial reality of the other nationality. So therefore, they were not acting in accordance with emancipatory principles and communist principles in their view, based on that. So this was the main debate that was going on. Now, after 48, this becomes almost irrelevant for them internally in that party. And the debate does not resurface until the 1990s, when you have a new Arab party emerging, led by Azmi Bshara, who is now in exile in Qatar, but that party is called Tajammu'. So Tajammu' is basically essentially a split from the Communist Party that says that there should have been emphasis on Arab identity in the Communist Party. Arab identity was a bit suppressed in the 1950s by the Communist Party. That was the formula that allowed them to work. But however, it was a party that organized the Arab masses. And it was a party that represented the most progressive horizon possible within the parameters that it existed at the time. So you had this debate going on. Now, you had new movements that got formed later on in the occupied territories, 1948 occupied territories, or what's referred to as the State of Israel. Those movements they essentially took a different kind of character altogether. There was a movement that was called Abna al-Balad. And Abna al-Balad, it means the sons of the land, or the children of the land. It's essentially referring to the indigenous population. It was saying that they represented the indigenous Palestinian population in that land. But that only emerges in the early 1970s. So it took a long time for that trend to be able to be formalized. So in the 1950s, early 60s, the communists are the main show in town. They offer enormous advantages, and this should be remembered, despite some of the many critiques that were waged against them. There's no doubt that when it came to education, the Israeli Communist Party was basically the body that allowed for initial education to happen in amongst the ranks of Palestinians in 1948, because they were discriminated against and they were not allowed to, their numbers in Israeli universities were heavily suppressed.
They would bring Palestinians to the Soviet Union or other communist countries to get education.
Correct. And that's a big role that the Eastern Bloc played at the time, not only in Palestine, but across the colonized world. When we talk about evaluating the communist experience worldwide, we should not forget that dimension.
The Toilers of the East.
Toilers of the East was the initial experiment, but later on, every major university anywhere in the Eastern Bloc did have scholarships for students from across Asia and Africa, including Palestine, including Palestinian students who had Israeli citizenship and were under Israeli rule at this stage. So that was their first access to education. And you had so many young professionals that graduated from that, writers, medical doctors. It was of immense importance for a population that was poor. Remember, in 1948, for the most part, it was the poorer section of society that remained. It was a peasantry. And it doesn't mean that, there were no, rich landowners left or anything like that. But for the most part, you had the exit of the bourgeoisie and the traditional urban notable leaderships and the middle classes. So you had a serious problem in this era: lack of education, lack of services, lack of leadership. And people had to build themselves from nothing. So the Communist Party afforded that. It also afforded a cultural space and a place for resistance within parameters that existed at the time. And that's something that's captured in an excellent book by Maha Nassar, a Palestinian scholar at University of Arizona. It's called Brothers Apart. So for people who are interested in that experiment, definitely it's an excellent book to read. So you have these different kind of experiences going on. And really the Communist Party in certain moments, it gets also radicalized itself. So after 56, after the Suez, tripartite aggression, that's a turning point for that party. And certainly, in subsequent years, it gets more and more involved in organizing Palestinian ranks. For a long time, it's the dominant force.
And at this time, throughout the 1950s, is it fair to say that the base of the Israeli Communist Party is overwhelmingly Palestinian, while the leadership is somewhat mixed, Palestinian and Jewish?
Yes, you could say that. Of course, the Israeli Communist Party is also the only space where you can have progressive Jewish voices who are critical of Zionism. At this stage, there aren't that many that are coming out as fully anti-Zionist, but people with hesitations, people who don't want to erase Palestinians, they end up entering this party. But the membership is on the Jewish side is limited by the fact that, for the most part, sociologically, the settler colonial dimension is going to be predominant amongst this population, because that's the reality. You can't represent, it's not a natural working class. If a Communist Party is, in theory at least, supposed to be the leadership of a proletariat, in this case, it has to navigate not only a class dynamic, but also it has to navigate a colonial dynamic. And the colonial dynamic is actually core to the logic of the entire state it was operating in. It is at the heart of it. So how you navigate that contradiction as a Communist Party is a tricky thing, very tricky thing.
Are there any encounters throughout the 1950s between those Palestinians who remain within the newly established state of Israel and Mizrahi Jews who, as Usama Magdisi described on The Dig, represent the second corollary tragedy to the Nakba, because as a result of Zionism, Arab-Jewish coexistence, the very possibility of being an Arab Jew is destroyed throughout the region. And as Avi Shleim's research has shown recently, that Zionist agents actually played a major role in terrorizing Iraqi Jews, Baghdadi Jews, so that they would make Aliyah to Israel. During this period in the 1950s, as Mizrahi Jews' identity are being remade from that of Arab Jew to Mizrahi Jew, are there moments of encounter and possibility, kind of counterfactual other trajectories that might have taken place?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question, Daniel. And the reality is, like, first of all, we have to recognize that the struggle for Mizrahi Jews was very complicated. And this is something that Ella Shohat and others, I mean, Ella has played a pioneering role in shedding light on this in the Western academia, but also like many others who were activists in places like the Communist Party understood and talked about, not necessarily as in the same public way. They understood that this was a population that was in many ways completely displaced from its natural environment and surroundings, which were Arab surroundings. You know, especially with the Iraqi Jewish community, to which both Avi and Ella belong. You know, this was such an old community. It's the oldest Jewish community in the world. You know, the oldest continuously existing Jewish community in the world. It's older than the Jewish community in Palestine in terms of constant existence. You know, Iraq always had a substantial number of Jews in it, which cannot be said for Palestine. You know, there are major disruptions to Jewish life there in different stages. So in the case of Iraq, can you imagine losing everything because of this creation of the state of Israel? I mean, there were no problems that led to, I'm not saying that it was perfect universe before, but you never had the sort of push factors that led to mass displacement when it came to the Iraqi Jewish community, for example, until the foundation of the state of Israel. And then you had the research that Avi and others have unearthed that showed how there was this terrible collusion between the Israeli state and its agents and its security agents, and of course the Iraqi state under the control of the British Empire at the time, which was under Nouri Said, Britain's strong man in Iraq. They had this collusion that led to the displacement of Iraqi Jews from Iraq. And a big part of this displacement and this exile happened as a result of bombs that were placed in synagogues, and that Avi has found were actually placed by the Israeli state. So in any case, we have this situation where you have this expulsion going on of Palestinians, and you have this exile under coercive circumstances that was manufactured in Iraq and cooked together between this reactionary Arab government and this essentially, you know, Israeli state, which was not interested in the welfare of Arab Jewish communities, but was interested in actually them as numbers.
And similarly painful stories in places like Yemen.
Yes, because what they were saying is essentially this was central planning for the Zionists. They actually said, and this was their documents showed this. They were sitting around saying, okay, we've just acquired all these lands, emptied them out of their Arab populations. We're trying to get European Jews here, but we don't have enough. Most of them want to go to the US. You know, first of all, you had all the people that got destroyed and killed as a result of the destruction of European Jewry during the Holocaust. So there was already the loss of 6 million people that the Zionist movement had initially envisioned as the main reservoir for the colonization. So you had already this massive, incredibly nasty genocide that had eradicated Jewish numbers in Europe in a large way. But then you had the other reality, which is the majority of Jews that existed now in this world were in places like the US, where they did not want to, you know, they were not going to leave the US for that project. So, except for ultra ideological reasons, like you'd have to be very committed to Zionism to want to leave the US to settle in Palestine. So essentially, they were looking at the map and they're like, okay, so we have to get the Iraqi Jews. We have to get the Moroccan Jews. We have to get the Yemeni Jews. We have to get the Egyptian Jews. It's going to be the Jews of the East that are going to make up, and essentially, basically, the Jews of Arab and Muslim countries, Iranian Jews. We're going to get those to come, and that's going to be the main reservoir. And later on, of course, because they do have a sense of racial hierarchy, unfortunately, in this Zionist project, the last thought is Ethiopian Jews. And they have also a sense of racial hierarchy within Arab communities, even. Zionists it's a very racist movement. At the top of the kind of level, you have German Jews, and then, Russian Jews and various Eastern European Jewish communities. And then you have grades of Mizrahi Jews. It's a very racist vision in operation.
With Yemenis at the bottom or near the bottom.
Yemenis at the bottom, Iraqis are at the top because they're, educated, well integrated, that kind of thing. But even Iraqis, who are supposed to be at the top of the Arab Jewish ladder, were sprayed with DDT. They were treated really badly. And again, people like Ella Shohad have been talking about it for a long time, but Avi's memoir, which I recommend to people to read, obviously, his memoir, because it gives an evocative sense of personal experience of that. What does it mean for an Iraqi Jewish kid like Avi to even go to school and be criminalized for speaking Arabic and treated really badly? So he ended up actually erasing his own Arabness for many years. And now he's kind of coming back to himself by saying, well, actually, I am an Arab Jew that I've always had to repress that. It was a very painful experience for a young child to go through that. And that's just one example out of thousands. So in the Communist Party, you had, however, a different experience because you had all these Iraqi Jews that had been in the Communist Party. And we know from previous episodes that Jewish and Christian and other minority communities played an outstanding role in Arab progressive movements. They made major contributions to these movements, and in some cases, they were founders of some of these movements. So Iraqi Jewish cadres in the Communist Party were very important, played an excellent role in the development of that party. And they were now coming in and confronting this new horrific reality of, the Israeli state, joining. Some of them end up becoming, writers in the organs of the Communist Party, contributing to its newspapers like Al-Ittihad, and you have figures like Sami Mikhail, others that are very active in this. There's a big literature on this now. A lot of people are writing about these experiences.
Was there some possibility of the retention of Arab Jewish identity amongst the displaced Eastern Jews that would have allowed for a kind of anti-Zionist solidarity with remaining Palestinians within the state of Israel? Or did the very nature of the Zionist project make that impossible?
It made it very difficult, Daniel. And I think you had individual cases where, Arab Jews would feel at home talking to Palestinians or, especially within the Israeli state or so on. But unfortunately, on a collective level, it was impossible because remember, these were not the people in charge or in power. They had left as refugees. They had become refugees themselves. Now, it was of no fault of Palestinians. That's why all these ridiculous Zionist claims of there's a population exchange that happens in 1948, it's outrageous because Palestinians did not expel Arab Jews. It was Arab Jews ended up in their tragedy because of the collusion between these awful Arab reactionary states and this, honestly, this Zionist Zionist body that does not care about any human life around it, including Arab Jewish life, if it's going to serve its purposes. So, they're so obsessed. They were so obsessed at the time with bolstering the numbers of Jews in Palestine and within what became the state of Israel, and did not care if that's a good thing for people, to be uprooted from the countries that they had always lived in. And that's not to deny also the fact that the creation of the state of Israel led to the rise of sometimes anti-Semitic incidents, in addition to the work of these reactionary regimes and so on. But we should emphasize here that actually most organized political movements rejected anti-Semitism officially in the Arab region. There's, again, a lot of research on that. So the whole thing was so tragic and sad. But I will tell you, on a hopeful note, Daniel, if one day we see a situation where the Zionist project is defeated in that land, one of the main sources of hope will be that people will reclaim their Arab Jewish identities. And that's a considerable part of the population. Call it a fantasy or whatever, but I think these things are important also as we imagine futures that are emancipatory for everybody. One of the questions that we have to ask is, what will be the sources of commonality between the settler colonists and the native population that exists there? And I think that restoring a sense of Arab Jewish identity can be an important component in that. Because Arab Jews are the closest people to Palestinians in that society. And there will have to be a liberation formula for that. And I think it's possible to imagine that. Unfortunately, Zionism has created a situation where that's not the way people are socialized. It's kind of weird because also, like, Arab Jews look so similar to Palestinians. They have similar cultural habits, but then you end up in a situation where, well, they're getting drafted to the army, and they're killing people that look like them. They're part of a structure of oppression against those people. So that creates fissures as well, and it's all sorts of contradictions emerge. Same goes for Ethiopian Jews. You can imagine they're racialized in nasty ways by the Zionist system. And nevertheless, they're put in positions of power over Palestinian women, men, and children, and the elderly. That's, by the way, that's the bit that pains me the most when I would go to these checkpoints, and you see these young conscripts, Arab Jewish conscripts, Ethiopian Jewish conscripts, different, who come from cultures where the respect for the elderly is so important, but then they're put in a structural position and socialized into this Zionist like outlook where they end up humiliating Palestinian older men, things like that. It's so sad. It's heartbreaking, because that's also negation of people's cultures and backgrounds and outlooks. And in many ways, that's why it's so important to read Fanon, I think, because this understanding of essentially colonialism as a process that degrades everybody, native and settler alike, is so important for us to understand. And we see living examples of it in Palestine today. Now, I don't know what's going to happen after the genocide, honestly, Daniel, because genocide is also creating such a nasty reality there, and it's so painful. So we also have to grapple with the question of what will liberation look after genocide. And I know these are big questions that we won't be able to answer today in the dig, but maybe it's something to think about for the future. I'll end with one thing. Palestinians in the 50s were predicting that Zionism's objective is total elimination. And part of what they were doing throughout this process, and these were people that, again, had either been completely expelled or had been put under military rule in the Israeli state, or came under the rule of Arab states that were not allowing them to self-organize towards the liberation of their country. These people who felt so oppressed at the time were afraid of a future that was going to be even worse if they don't act at the time. And they were saying, look, this state is becoming very powerful. The settler colonial state is now acquiring more and more weapons. Once they started detecting this developing a nuclear program, they freak out even more. They say, unless we work towards liberating the territory now, liberation will become irreversible. When we use the word liberation, I should emphasize that liberation for them was very much meant, and a key component of it meant return, because these were refugees that were expelled from their lands. So the idea was people would return to their lands, and that you would have a situation where their villages and towns and cities that they were expelled from, they would go back to it. Unfortunately, in the United States today, a lot of people will tell you, oh, that means the eradication of the state of Israel. And this is like such an insane idea, that the notion of somebody coming back home translates in the minds of some people in this country as an eradicationist plan, is such an anti-refugee position. So when we think of Palestinians at this moment, it's very important to remember that their politics are quintessential refugee politics in a colonial context.
That was the 9th episode of Thawra, the Dig series on 20th century Arab politics with Abdel Razzaq Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University. A scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements, he's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website, an incredible resource that will be back online soon. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that revolutions are the locomotives of history, while other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Congratulations on getting hitched, Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinator is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theorio Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and now also Instagram at thedigradio. And please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it's on iTunes or wherever, also leave us a nice review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. So does spreading the word to your friends. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly contribution or an annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks a month is huge.